Hi everyone, welcome to Kembali 2020 of Rebuild Bali Festival, a digital program designed to inspire, excite, reconnect, and revitalize the Balinese and Indonesian community from 29th October to 8th November 2020. Kembali, the Indonesian word for return or come back, represents revitalization in the face of global challenges. The festival will unite people in Bali and Indonesia together with an international audience at a time when travel is largely impossible and creating connections is more important than ever before. I'm Kritika Vargor. I'm an American journalist and author. I lived in Indonesia from 2016 to early 2020 as a foreign correspondent. And I wrote a book, The Call, about how Saudi money changed the Muslim world. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with William Dalrymple, who, if you're watching this session, probably needs no introduction. He's a world-renowned Scottish historian, writer, art historian, and curator, as well as a broadcaster and critic, and co-founder of the Jaipur Literary Festival. He's the author of a dozen books, and we're in conversation today about his most recent book, which is brilliant and is the fourth in his company quartet of books about Mughal India and the British Raj. It's called The Anarchy, and it's a riveting new history of the East Company and how this little corporation took over one of the richest regions in the world in the 18th century. William, it's really great to be in conversation with you. He is currently in Italy on a writer's retreat working on his next book. He's extremely prolific, but we will save that for the end. How are you doing today?
I've had a week of perfect Italian sunshine, broken today by the most torrential storm. So I've actually had to do some work today. I've been sitting inside with the familiar Scottish sound of rain running down windows. I've been transported back to my very damp Scottish childhood, everything I went to India to escape, really.
It was, I mean, I have to say that climate, the rain is amenable to writing. I wrote my one and only book in London for the most part, and I found that the weather never distracted me, which was very positive.
No, there is definitely, if you ask how I've written 12 books, the rain have definitely assisted. No question. But no, I'm above Lake Como, and it's been this sort of perfect autumnal, almost sort of lavender color with snow on the snow peaks, and it's been utterly beautiful. I've hardly been inside the last week, and suddenly now I can just hear the rain pouring down outside.
Oh, I'm glad you're enjoying it. It sounds very idyllic, and I'm glad that you're able to get back into Italy after what their spring was like over there.
Yes, it's now one of the safest places, COVID-wise. Yeah. They had a terrible spring, as you rightly said, and then Italians took it all very seriously, and they have I think the highest compliance in Europe of mask wearing, more than the Germans, which is a side of the Italian character that none of us had ever realized before. So we have now these law-abiding Italians being very safe and well behaved, but it's worked. And unlike Britain, unlike France, particularly unlike Spain, there is no enormous second wave yet, although apparently it's getting a little bit worse.
Fingers crossed for them. I, for one, cannot relate. I'm based in New York now. Like I've been in many different parts of America, and the less said about any of them, the better. But God help us all. So I wanted to dive in to your reporting process for this book, which I absolutely loved. I've read most of your books, especially loved City of Gins, which I read when I was living in Niz East last year, your old stomping grounds.
I'm sorry our paths didn't cross.
Oh yeah, well, I was not there for super long, but I'll bring you next time. But I wanted to ask, the book opens with this kind of detective story, and I love it when writers show their work. And you talk about how in the National Archives in Delhi, the 19th century records from the Raj are pretty well kept, but the 18th century ones you had to do a little bit more digging for. And you said some of the librarians there helped you out. Can you talk about why those records were so hard to access?
Sure. The whole story of the British in India is really very well chronicled from the British side. because the entire archive from the East India Company, then the India office, is sitting in the British Library, 35 miles of it. On the other hand, that's where all the scholars normally go to study this stuff. And the National Archives in Delhi, which are the usual Indian conundrum to get into. And you have to come with triplicate letters from everyone imaginable, almost the Pope, the chief priest of Varanasi, and the kind of Sharif of Mecca is necessary to get you involved in there. But it's once you're in there, it's fairly chaotic, but very few scholars have worked there, and the archives are fabulous. What you get in London is what they sent back to the head office. So in other words, it's what they wanted everyone in London to think. It's rather like, it's as unreliable as an undergraduate's letters to their parents telling them what they've been up to at college. There are endless half-truths and all the important bits are missed out. The same is true really of the East India Company records. And the further you go up the tree, in a sense, the closer you get to what's actually happening. So what you've got in the National Archives in Delhi is the archive of the head office in Calcutta, moved to Delhi in 1947 at independence. So that's all the stuff they didn't want London to know. Then if you go to the regional archives like Allahabad or Peshawar in Pakistan or Lahore, you get the stuff they didn't want Calcutta to know about. So at every stage, some of these things are copies, and you realize you've seen it before. But quite often, the more regional you go, the more local you go, the closer you get to the real story. But the 18th century records in the National Archives are a bit of a mess, and even finding the catalogue to the 18th century papers was something which, I mean, it wasn't there, it wasn't on display, and there was no way of accessing. And two brilliant women who worked there took it as a challenge rather than just saying no, and burrowed away into the depths of their bowels of their archives and found it eventually, unbound, falling to bits, but there it was, the early 18th century indexes. And within a week of that turning up, I was sitting looking at Clive's report from the Battle of Plassey, the letter written from the battle, which is, history. This is the battle which begins the whole business of the territorial colonization of India by the British. And there was the first draft of the first letter from the first battle. And those sort of treasures are there if you're lucky and you persist.
Wow, that's really cool. I feel like in all of the books that I've read of yours, there's some kind of, at least one of these kind of amazing discoveries of some.
It's half the battle in the book. I mean, I always feel that, with history, you have to, particularly when doing a period which is much written about, there's really no excuse to write a new book, however wonderful your style, however fresh your angle, however hot your take. There's really no excuse to it unless you actually do come up with a whole chunk of new archival stuff. And I'm lucky that the field I work in, the East India Company, it's not difficult to do that. There is an awful lot of material which hasn't been looked at. Another lovely discovery very early on in the same batch of documents that came up with the letter from Plassey was an intelligence report, anonymous. No, it's not clear who wrote this, but it's the version that was presented to the directors of the company, telling them that there was a French fleet loading up armaments and heading for India. Now, it turned out that this document was actually false, that the fleet in question seems to have been actually sailing to Canada, to that conflict that anyone that's a Daniel Day-Lewis fan remembers The Last of the Mohicans, with him jumping over sort of mountains in Ohio and all that sort of stuff. So the French were actually sending armaments over there. But the East India Company believed that they were sending them to Bengal, so sent Robert Clive off in that direction. And that was how this whole story began. So, and it's two nice little finds right at the beginning of research, which gave a slightly fresh spin to the whole familiar story.
Yeah. And just one other question I had, not to spend too much time on the sources, but I love that you used some Persian sources too, which you mentioned were translated by your close friend who passed away, and you've memorialized Bruce Flanell. Can you talk about what the Persian sources, which a lot of people may not realize that Persian was still widely used at the early part of the British contact with India. What did they add to the record? And what is the kind of mindset shift that you have to, if any, that you have to go through when you're looking through Persian sources from this time? Is there a different approach to documenting history contemporaneously?
So India has, certainly in the Islamic period, in other words, from the 12th century onwards, an incredibly strong historiographic tradition. There's an awful lot of history being written from the first hand: autobiography, biography, history, memoir. And the language that most of it's written in is Persian, which was the court language, rather like a lot of Europe used French, for example, in the 19th century. Why all those women in Tolstoy are constantly speaking French, because it was the language of the court and the language of diplomacy. In the same way, Persian, although the Persians as such never conquered India, it was the language of court initially in the Islamic courts in the north, but then spreading right down to the south. So even, you know, the famous Shivaji, the great Maratha hero, and in the eyes of many Hindus, the liberator of India from Islamic rule, even his court used a great deal of Persian documentation. And the Persian that is used in India is obviously slightly different from the Persian that's used in Afghanistan and in Persia. And in, you know, Persian, like English, is a language that adapts and borrows words from where it's from, just like English has taken in many Indian words during the Raj. And I was very lucky with my friend Bruce, who died of cancer in January. And for 20 years we worked together on all these Persian sources for this quartet. And I mean, none of us were to know that, I suppose, a month and a half after I delivered the manuscript for Anarchy, that Bruce would be diagnosed with galloping pancreatic cancer. But we had completed this book, and this is as much his monument as mine. And Bruce was able not only to, he was very talented guy. He was an extraordinary character. He was penniless. He lived in state accommodation in York. He'd never had a job, but was a genius and had two related gifts, which were music and languages. And he spoke almost every European language. Certainly he seemed to be able to, even Flemish, I heard him once speak, which I don't know how he picked up Flemish. But also he lived in Persia, spoke completely perfect modern idiomatic Persian, lived in Afghanistan and spoke perfect Dari, and spoke fairly good Urdu, Hindi, Pashto, which meant that he was able to understand, between all these different gifts, 18th century Indian Persian with a rare fluency, and also had a great gift as a translator into Persian, into English. And so his actual English prose is exquisite too. And we were great friends, and he kind of moved in more or less for 20 years. And at times he put himself in a tent at the end of the garden. At other times he moved to the house when it was cold. And he was very eccentric. He would spend a lot of time in the kitchen making sort of rare delicacies, and occasionally would take over the house and have parties and concerts. And I never quite knew who Bruce had invited to lunch or to dinner, but he used to work at night. And I would come back from parties to see Bruce typing away and would produce these exquisite translations. And as I say, if the English sources for the East India Company are fairly well traveled in their English, in their London British Library incarnation, and the East India Company sources in Delhi are less well known, the Persian sources are almost untouched, because today no one could read them. There's a handful of scholars in SOAS and so on that can read this. And also some of them are in scribal shorthand, Shikasta script, which doesn't have diacritical marks, and is really very difficult to read unless you're a specialist. So Bruce was able to take all this specialist stuff and sit in a sort of Cecil Beaton straw hat with his photocopies from the British Library, wearing sort of kurta pajamas or looking like some figure out of a sort of 1920s Vogue shoot, and produce these elegant, gorgeous translations, which are the principal. I suspect, long after people have got bored of my of my writings and theories, they will still be reading my books just to get at Bruce's gorgeous translations, which will be probably even more inaccessible then than they are now. And yes, we completed it, but I'm not quite sure. It's very hard to imagine returning to that world without him by my side. It's rather daunting.
Yeah,
prospect.
I'm sorry for your loss, but it really comes through in this book, the density of different sources that almost give this like eyewitness feel to the historical episodes that you recount, as you have said, are not completely untrodden territory, but it feels very fresh in the level of detail that comes through in your telling.
One other thing I should say is the French sources, because of course this is a period when the French and the English are competing for control, not only of Canada and all that Lost Mohican stuff, but the Caribbean. The French are arming my Scottish forebears against the Jacobites against the English, and also we're at work trying to beat the English East India Company out of India. And there is a whole variety of wonderful French sources too, one of whom, this wonderful Comte de Madame, was a friend of all the great 18th century French philosophers, of Voltaire and so on. And again, he was a wonderful scholar, never translated before into English, and deeply disdainful of the British, and greatly admiring of the Mughals. So it provides a wonderfully sort of francophile source as well. So anyway, yeah, there's a wide variety of material, and my task was to pull together all this stuff into something that was readable and hopefully a little bit racy.
Yeah, I think it succeeded for sure. One of my favorite fun facts that is a kind of throwaway is about how Madras Putnam, one of the first, or the first colonial city, was maybe founded because of Francis Day's love for a Tamil woman who lived nearby.
Right.
Yeah.
And he found it.
And I'm Tamil, so I thought that was funny. I shared that with my family who lives in Chennai, then now Madras Putnam, which they thought was very entertaining. And I wanted to ask, going from his history to kind of the language used in the book, you use a lot of super modern terms like too big to fail and bailout, hostile takeover to advance your, the picture you're painting of the East India Company as like a very rapacious modern corporation that's very familiar to us today in the world we live in. But you want us to see this company as one of the earliest examples of that.
Yeah.
So can you talk about when you first started to see can you start, when did it start to take shape for you? You've been working on this period and these characters in some way for a really long time, but when did seeing the company and presenting it in this as a modern rapacious corporation start to form in your mind?
I mean, it's not the first time that this, in a sense, this spin has been given. There was a wonderful book 20 years ago called The Company That Changed the World. And I mean, it's a simple statement of fact that the East India Company wasn't quite the first joint stock company, but it was, I think, fifth. And this idea that you founded a company not by pulling family money together or by a guild of wool merchants pooling resources to go off and, buy tapestries in Belgium or whatever a medieval wool guild would have done, that you gather money from a whole variety of sources and that people get a share of the profits based on the share they have put in of their savings. And this is, a radically new Elizabethan idea, was something that completely transformed world commerce. And, old supporters of the Raj, when they talk about the British effect on India, would normally mention cricket or railways, or what about the railways was always the great cry for the kind of pro-imperialist camp. But I think you could easily argue that the most important export that Britain made to India was, in fact, just the idea of the company. The idea that you have a variety of investors can pull together their resources and create a joint stock company where everyone has shares. is an idea that was invented. It's not a natural human idea. It's an innovation that came out of Elizabethan England, and it obviously, you know, most Indians today work for companies who aren't working as farmers, and it's a very profound change to the landscape of the world. But it began with one company. Well, it went global with one company, the East India Company, and the East India Company very quickly learnt all the things that we, in a sense, that are both most wonderful and beneficial about companies, but also the things that we fear most about companies. So there's no question that the company at its height, you know, provided vast amounts of employment and repaid its debts to its shareholders, to its investors, and you know, did very effectively what companies are there to do, which is to create wealth on a massive scale. But it also did all the things that we fear companies for, like, for example, bribing parliamentarians. 1690, within 90 years of the founding of the company, the East India Companies realized that you could actually, you know, pass share options or wodges of cash to MPs who will then vote in their favor in Parliament. This is a new idea in 1690, but, you know, we've seen obviously various forms of this, the bribery of legislatures in every country subsequent. They invented corporate lobbying. They invented the idea that you can also, you know, buy MPs by buying them a seat, by campaigning for them and creating your own interest in Parliament. And finally, they invented the idea that, you know, they realized pretty soon that they were richer than many states, that this corporation, still based for much of its history in a single property in London, 5 windows wide at the time it was marauding through Bengal and UP and conquering the Mughals. It had its own private army, and it toppled nations. So the sort of thing that, you know, has haunted 20th century history, like, for example, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company getting the CIA to topple Mossadegh in Iran because they wanted to nationalize the oil interests in Iran. 1956, you get a coup. Mossadegh, the first and only democratic leader of Iran, gets killed, and the Shah moves in. And the rest of modern history follows. 1977, in 1956, you get the Anglo, what's it called? The Anglo, is it the Anglo Fruit Company? Whatever it is, anyway, in Guatemala. They're going to have, they're going to have their land nationalized by a socialist government. They produce a coup, and the phrase "Banana Republic" is born. ITT in Chile in 1977, toppling Allende. So these are, you know, the idea that a corporation can be very rich and can bribe, influence, and lobby its way so that it can do what governments can bend the will of governments to its profit, is something that the company mastered very early on, and is a legacy. I mean, the whole question, you know, for example, of how, you know, the Gulf War, how far Exxon did or did not influence the Bush government is something that subsequent historians will chew over. But, you know, that there was a great deal of influence is, you know, we now know, and many people knew at the time very well, that Saddam Hussein had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. He was a Ba'athist government that tortured his lovers. And yet the Exxon and other oil interests persuaded the Bush government that the first thing you had to do after 9/11 was not go after the Saudis, but go after the Iraqis, who had nothing at all to do with it.
I've read that Saddam Hussein, not to make light of this, is indirectly responsible for you going to India. Is that right? He foiled your plans for a day.
It is true. As a kid, in Scotland, it wasn't because of Indiana Jones, but I rather fancied the idea of being Indiana Jones. And my first trip to London from Scotland was to go and see the Tutankhamun exhibition, which was there in the 70s. When, incidentally, I remember coming out of the thing and seeing my first Hare Krishna procession, which is probably my first time ever been to anything.
Yeah, I saw quite a few of those too. Yeah.
Very big in London in the 70s. But then when I left school, first thing I wanted to do was go and dig in Iraq. and I got a place on a dig at British School of Archaeology in Baghdad, and then they closed it down because Saddam Hussein thought it was a nest of British spies. But for which my life may have been very different. I was recruited by MI6 and ended up as James Bond, but I'm very happy the way it went otherwise.
Well, we're all very lucky you ended up in India. I wanted to ask, in terms of contemporary parallels, and just because it comes up quite a lot in your telling, is that the British public was kind of early on made aware of some of the crimes and excesses of the East India Company. And as you said, it was part of the daily newspaper diet, starting from the 18th century well into the Victorian era, when there was a lot of kind of moral concerns by some sectors in what they were doing. But it would take, even from the Victorian era onward, it would take another century for the Raj to finally dissolve. And not because the public lobbied for it or anything, but because, World War II and the Indian independence movement. I'm curious, and I know that history is not didactic, but what's the value, or what do you take away from the fact that people were aware of it? It was part of the newspaper diet. Did it have any effect inside England or the UK, that people were aware of some of these things at the time? Or is it just an interesting phenomenon that, like, so
well, two things
we read today, we kind of are aware of things that go on in the world?
So two answers to that. First is, I think it's very disappointing whenever you actually investigate this to see how little interest the metropolis had in the empire in general, but India in particular. All debates about India in Parliament throughout the whole parliamentary history of the British Raj were always famously badly attended. There was a handful of MPs bothering to turn up at these things. And if you look at British literature, the great age of the English novel, Dickens, George Eliot, Jane Austen, India barely appears. There's Kipling, frankly a pretty minor author. E.M. Forster, nice, but again, not one of the true greats of English literature. A tiny bit of Thackeray. There's not much, and I think those of us that work in Indian history or post-colonial studies can exaggerate how much awareness there was at all of where all this money was coming from. And I think this was even more true in the East India Company than it was in the Raj, because the Raj had a monopoly. And by the dint of its charter, no one could get to India without the East India Company's passport. So there was no question of sort of investigative journalists turning up and doing on the ground reports like you do, Kritika, from the Bengal famine or anything. Hot takes of the New York Review of Books were not known in the days of the East India Company. And it was very underreported. And the first time that the British public really got a clear steer on what was going on was when the company went down in 1774, having plundered Bengal so badly and having effectively killed the goose that laid the golden egg by their own greed. Then this famine came in 1770, for which they'd made absolutely no preparation and for which they made no soup kitchens or labor camps or anything to try and save people, as a result of which at least 1 million Bengalis died. Now, this seems to rattle a fair number of East India Company servants, and you get, for the first time, whistleblower accounts. There's 2 whole-length books, one by a man called Alexander Dow, another by William Boltz, and there's a whole lot of anonymous articles which appear in The Spectator and The Gentleman's Magazine and all these publications in London, giving really very frank and horrific pictures of dead bodies piling up in the streets and dogs eating corpses in the Ganges and clouds of flies and plagues of feral dogs and this sort of stuff. And one of the nice things, as a Brit whose family was involved in the East India Company, you're always fatally hoping that there's going to be someone with some moral sense at some point in the story. And one of the kind of only moments that this actually happens is when the famine is reported, and you get demonstrations. You get people turning up and doing, rather what you'd have today in the event of a major corporate screw up, like Union Carbide or something. People demonstrate. There's a couple of plays put on in London. Clive is satirized as Lord Vulture. There's another one called the Nabob, satirizing the new rich coming back from India and trying to set themselves up as gentlemen. But again, the nature of that play, again, indicates a lot of the motives. It wasn't just that people were worried about Indians starving to death. There was also this anxiety, rather like you had in New York or London in the 1980s, at new rich vulgarity. And in the same way that people in the 80s loved to hate merchant bankers and hedge fund managers, all your Harvard colleagues who went pouring into McKinsey's and all those jobs, everyone loves to hate those people and envy them and wish they had their salaries. And that's rather what was happening with the East India Company in the 18th
century. Sounds like history is in every possible way cyclical. Well, yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about Clive. This is Robert Clive, one of the main characters in your book, became known as Clive of India, and he comes across as this very ruthless, determined, effective, enterprising, but also very lucky person. And you speak explicitly in the book of his luck. Of course, history is contingent, and anything could happen. But how do you maintain this sense as a historian of conveying his luck, and how much role kind of coincidence and things like that played in the rise of someone like Clive when you know how things turned out?
Well, Napoleon always said, "I want my generals lucky," and I think it's one of those things like inspiration in a writer or any artist. I think it was Picasso who said, inspiration exists, but it's got to find you. It's got to find you working. And I think the same is true of luck. That luck exists, but it's got to find you fighting if you're a general. And Clive was this character who, rather like in the early 20th century, all those Confederate generals in the United States got put on horseback and erected as statues all over the country. So in Britain, Clive became this great symbol of imperialism late in the early 20th century, a full century and a half after he died. And Clive actually died in disgrace, having been censored by Parliament. He got off having to repay all his wealth, but he was still heavily censored. And he took his own life. He cut his jugular with a paper knife. Over the course of 100 years, he then gets turned into this imperial totem, the symbol of British vigor and valor in India. And he is a fascinating character. He's my Lord Voldemort. I loved writing about him. He is deeply evil in all sorts of ways. He's incredibly ruthless, total racist, hypocrite, but as you said in your introduction, effective. He always wins. He wins on the battlefield in India. He wins in the boardroom when he's back in London in the East India Company, and he wins in Parliament. And he's a very charismatic man that has this sort of dark ability to get his way and to force his way onto events and alter them. I mean, it's very interesting. One of the great, I suppose, differences or disputes in the writing of history today is that most academic history takes a slightly dim view of great men. The idea that a single individual can change the course of history is, in the views of many, something that went out with Tolstoy. But I think, as we all know from contemporary history, an individual can change the course. America would not be the country it is today if Trump wasn't clowning around in his vulgar, energetic, vicious way. India would not be the India it is today without Narendra Modi. A leader can make a great difference and can alter. There are endless possibilities in any country's trajectory. And there are cases when an individual can change the trajectory of a country. I mean, would Britain have won the Second World War and pulled together without Churchill? I mean, Churchill's a very unfashionable character in India and rightly held responsible for the Bengal famine. But there's no question that his speeches in the Second World War, rallied British spirit at a time when the whole of the rest of continental Europe was under Nazi occupation. These things. So, I certainly like to write history that is full of and driven by characters, and Clive is exactly the sort of person that you thank your lucky stars for, that he writes spectacular letters, vicious, cynical, vile in many ways, but eminently quotable. And I set him off against someone who's his sort of polar opposite, who is the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. And Shah Alam is everything that Clive isn't. Shah Alam is civilized, educated, charming, eloquent, has the highest moral principles, but loses time after time. And Clive is this monster, wins time after time. And they, in a sense, symbolize these two different worlds, the aggressive, commercial, economically driven, but very effective East India Company of Clive, and this sort of late Mughal world of poetry and pigeons and couplets and mushairas, but they can't get their act together to minister a country or run or win a battle. It's very much that Satyajit Ray world of the chess players and so on, of a culture which is highly refined, but almost too refined to get up in the morning.
Yeah, I think your ability to conjure up this Mughal aesthetics, or especially late Mughal aesthetics, I think you've called it the Indo-Mughal tradition of writing poetry. And it's like this beauty tinged with impermanence and ornate objects and these big ephemeral spectacles, like going all out to throw these parties that'll disappear the next day. Who do you think is the heir or institution or person of that Indo-Mughal aesthetic legacy today in India? It certainly doesn't seem to be the government. I can't imagine them. They're as far from aesthetes as I can imagine.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's gone. It's not there anymore. It's that whole world there was a little bit of it still when I was first in India writing City of Gins. You could still go to Old Delhi and you could find these old professors of Persian who would quote couplets and flew pigeons from their roofs and had the most refined and impeccable manners. There's very little of that now. It's something I saw and has gone. There are many things in India that are better today. There are people are more prosperous. There are better restaurants in Delhi. You can see all the movies you ever want, and there are all sorts of things that make life in Delhi easier now than it was 30 years ago. But there's no question a great deal's been lost too. And I'm very glad I saw what I saw.
Yeah, luckily they left those great buildings behind. But yeah, it does feel like this completely disappeared world. I visited the burial place of the last Mughal in Yangon based on your book. So it does seem like they left a lot of traces.
So how long they'll survive if Yogi Adityanath gets his way?
That's true. That's a good point. It's quite fragile, but fingers crossed for all those wonderful monuments, especially in Delhi.
It is fragile. I feel it very strongly at the moment. That there is change afoot.
Yeah, it's definitely scary. I mean, you would know better than me, but when I was there, a lot of them were being restored by like the Aga Khan Trust and kind of foreign bodies, but it definitely doesn't seem like India is super interested in maintaining some of these sites. And you yourself discovered like a Mughal building.
India has equal opportunities and neglect. A lot of the Hindu buildings are falling apart too. It's not just
yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, and the Buddha trail in Bihar and so on. It's very neglected. I'm curious. I'm Indian, and I grew up kind of hearing this trope, which I'm sure you've heard a lot in India too, of divide and rule, divide and conquer, and that's what they did to us. They divided us. But the portrait that comes through in your book is very much like even the biggest polity, the Mughal Empire, was very this decadent phase. They didn't really have it together, but there were also all these other, the Maratha Confederacy and then the Mysore and all these. So it was not like, it was already kind of divided. I'm curious, what is your feeling about this divide and rule trope when it comes to the East India Company?
It's a very good question. And I'm always looking out for this phrase. And I haven't found it explicitly in the East India Company archives at all. I presume it must have been there in the later Raj, which I know much less well. Shashi Tharoor, I think, attributes it to one of the later viceroys. But it's interesting, it's so fixed in the Indian mind, this idea of divide and rule, and it's just not there during the 250 years of the East India Company. I mean, occasionally that policy, there's a moment when, the East India Company takes out, what happens, we should go back one stage. The Mughal Empire rules almost the whole of India towards the end of Shah Jahan and the beginning of Aurangzeb's reign. And then Aurangzeb overextends, irritates the Marathas burst out. And then the Persians come from the north and seize the wealth of Delhi. Nadir Shah just takes back the Kohinoor, the Peacock Throne and all this stuff. And it's like, imagine a huge Baroque mirror and you throw it out of a third-story window. It shatters into a million pieces. That's what happens after Nadir Shah. And Jodhpur, Jaipur, the Marathas, all these different, Hyderabad, Mysore, all these different forces compete against each other. And the East India Company takes them out one by one. And then there's one man, Nana Fadnabis, who really understands the threat of the company. He's the Maratha vizier, and he tries to pull together what he calls the Triple Alliance. He tries to get the Marathas' worst enemies, Tipu Sultan and the Nizam of Hyderabad, to join him in getting rid of the East India Company. But it doesn't work. Within a few years, Scindia, who's one of the Maratha generals, has made his own treaty with the company, and then they unpick the alliance bit by bit. And so there's no question that Indian disunity played a huge, vital and central role in the company's progress. But it's not true that the company actively and coherently had a policy of divide and rule which formulated its foreign policy. Occasionally you find a version of that being put into place, but it's never articulated as divide and rule, and it's more piecemeal.
That definitely comes across, like this opportunistic quality of the EIC.
Yeah, it's pragmatic, it's opportunistic, and what's also crucially important, I think, and the thing that surprised Indians most, I think, in the book, is the degree to which the company gets the support of the financial and banking sectors in India, particularly the Marwari bankers, because the company is a company. It understands like balance sheets in the same way the Marwaris do. They speak the same language, but they may have different languages and different religions, but in terms of reading balance sheets and paying interest on time, they're on the same page. And the Marwaris back the company consistently, from the Jagat Seth, who finances Clive, through to the final wars against the Marathas. And very few of the bankers, the big Indian bankers, the biggest Indian bankers, back the Marathas or even the Mughals after a certain point. So the company, as well as having certainly initially more advanced warfare techniques, which it imports from Europe after the War of the Austrian Succession, when Frederick the Great invents this new infantry warfare. As well as having that, they also have consistently better finances. They can borrow money. And so when a war looms, they can just make more weapons, buy more mercenaries. And the most tragic thing of the whole story really is that India was not conquered by the Brits as such, or even by white soldiers. The East India Company conquers India using Indian troops. The Indian army, the East India Company's army in 1799 is 200,000 strong, which is almost exactly double the size of the British army at the same time. And those are not white troops. There's a small white officer class, but they are Indian troops, larger, many Tamils at this period. The soldiers on the front of the English edition lined up in a row are all Tamil Brahmins, who they thought were particularly fierce fighters. Telugu and then Biharis later on, particularly Rajputs and Brahmins again. And those soldiers conquered India for the East India Company using money borrowed from Indian bankers. And that, in a sense, is the thing that surprised the Desi readers, because that's certainly not taught in their history books.
No, it's not. Yeah, learning about the Jagat-Sets and these bankers was big revelation for me. I mean, I didn't grow up in India, obviously, but unfortunately, the idea of like a banking class selling out their own people is super familiar to most people in the world today. That was, yeah. I mean, how much of that was a surprise to you? You know this history, this period pretty well, but how much did you know about the Indian banking side of things before you dived into
that? Was very new to me because I'm not primarily, I suppose, an economic historian. And I studied it at Cambridge, but I don't. When I'm researching something, I tend to go for people's letters rather than the ledgers of. I mean, Neil Ferguson, who's a historian I disagree with in many ways, but I also hugely admire the way he has this ability to read the economics of a period and use it to tell the story. That's not my natural gift. And I found, though, that there'd been a fantastic amount of work on this. What I was saying was not in any sense my research about the Jagat-Sets. There was, particularly in the 80s, there was a whole lot of work coming out of Calcutta, and some amazing, such as Rajat Kantarai and Lakshmi Subramaniam, and there's a lot of, but done very much at the level of specialist papers, and never turned into a best-selling book by any Indian historian. And this, in a sense, I've been very lucky in my career, in that while there's been in fiction from my generation some of the world #1 players, an Indian fiction team would be the top first 11 in everything, in bowling, in batting, in fielding. You have Salman Rushdie, Amitav Ghosh, Vikram Seth, Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai, Aravind Adiga. Any one of them could be the captain. And then if you add in the Pakistanis, you've got Kamala Shamsi, and so South Asia produces this sort of world-class fiction team. But bizarrely, in both countries, there's actually, until recently, very, very little non-fiction. And the sort of book you wrote is an outlier in the Indian situation. It's starting now. You're getting a lot more journalistic books, a lot more politics, a little fiction, a little biography, and it's beginning. But it's not there yet. And so when you see some of the big non-fiction prizes, like the Pulitzers in America, the Samuel Johnson, as it was called now, the Baillie Gifford in Britain, or the Cundill History Prize, there's very rarely Indians on that. I mean, the two big exceptions probably are Maya Jasanoff of Harvard. I don't know whether she taught you, who's a wonderful writer who won the Cundill, and then Sid Mukherjee, who won the Pulitzer for The Emperor of All Maladies. So it's changing. But significantly, both Sid and Maya grew up in the US. They weren't, they didn't come out of the Indian system, which seems to produce again this constant stream of brilliant fiction writers. But anyway, I mean, for me, it's been lucky in that I've been able to harvest all this fantastic specialist work, which is brilliantly done, but has never been turned into a sort of a narrative history that Indians actually want to read. And this is one of the reasons, I think, this is one of the reasons that India's got itself in such a muddle about its history at the moment, because the histories that there are, the textbooks, are so bloody dull. Indians hate their history books, and they hate their history classes. And 9/10 of the fan letters I get from India begin with the same sentence, which is, "I hated history at school, but." And I think the failure, in a sense, of Indian academic historians to address their message to a wider audience in the way that, say, Stephen Greenblatt can take his learning as one of the world's great historians and produce a book like The Swerve, which wins the Pulitzer and is read by, you know, is at the #1 New York Times bestseller for a year. There is no Indian equivalent to Stephen Greenblatt, and we badly need one, because we badly need more understanding of the complexities of history. It isn't just, you know, Shivaji as an angel against Aurangzeb as a demon.
Or like Padmavat.
And
yeah.
midtones in between.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I totally agree. I think the first of your books I read that was really eye-opening was 9 Lives, which kind of brought some of these living religious traditions into this kind of exciting, accessible format. But I mean, I think hopefully that's changing. I'm reading Manu Pillai is this great writer of South Indian history. So
Manu
is
the like great hope for the future. We all love Manu. Yeah, he's great, and he's such a nice man too.
Hopefully there's more William Dalrymple acolytes who can follow in your footsteps for all these other regions.
He's his own man. He's no acolyte of mine, but he's certainly a friend. And,
yeah. Also counter. You know, my country does have these amazing historians like Jill Lepore and Stephen Greenblatt, but it's look where we're at right now. You can write as much great history as we want, but people still need to read it. Has been my experience. But you know, we'll keep fighting the good fight. One question I wanted to ask you, and I have a couple more, but we'll see if we run out of time. And just because of the context we're talking in, the next book you're working on, you've said, is about India's ideological colonization of Asia at the turn of the millennium, and kind of Indian and Hindu culture's soft power kind of across Southeast Asia and through Afghanistan. Can you talk about whether this book is going to include any work on Indonesia, and what's on your radar in terms of the archipelago?
So this is my first book, which will involve Bali, Java, Indonesia, Sumatra. And it's stuff that will be familiar to many people listening to this. This is the whole story of that period, particularly in the early centuries AD or CE, when you get, part 1 is the story of Buddhism, which is obviously starts in Bihar, but spreads up through what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan into Western China, and then gradually becomes the Chinese religion. So that's part 1 story. Part 2 is the story of particularly how Tamil Pallava culture washed out into Southeast Asia, into Sravanabhumi, the lands of gold, as of course the airport in Thailand is, the Bangkok airport is still named. And that whole story of how, at the end of this, you get the largest Hindu temple in the world built not in India, but in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. So so anyone, please, anyone that's got a lovely hotel or a beautiful villa you want to lend to a traveling writer, I am very much looking forward to visiting Bali and Indonesia as soon as lockdown is ended, and I'm happy to take all offers of gorgeous beach houses and so on. Also, anyone that knows their stuff and would like to help me with it, we're very welcome. But then part 3 is the story which I'm here in Italy researching, which is the story that some Indians know, but I think no one else in the world has really clicked, is how the numbers we use every day all over the world are originally Indian numbers, designed initially in their seed forms come from Ashoka Brahmi. They get taken by a family of Sanskrit-speaking Buddhist monks who become the viziers. They convert to Islam, become the viziers in Abbasid Baghdad, and become what the West calls Arabic numbers, although they are, of course, of Indian origin. And then they reach their final form in the most, that they actually look like the numbers we use today in Islamic Spain, in particularly Toledo. And then they move from Spain through to France and also from Sicily, which is where I was doing in Sicily and a couple of weeks ago, researching all that. And then there's this wonderful character, Frederick II, who I'm obsessed with, who's this that rarity, a kind of incredibly enlightened, questioning medieval Christian king, who converses in metaphysics and philosophy with the great sultans of his day, and he is persuaded to adopt the Indian numbering system by Fibonacci. And Fibonacci has grown up in Algeria, where his dad runs the Pisan customs house. And he's taught Arabic and goes to Arabic schools and learns the Arabic numbers there, then brings them back to Pisa. And there's this wonderful scene, which will be one of the last scenes in the book, where Frederick II holds a sort of mathematical contest in Pisa, and he throws his Jewish and his Islamic Spanish mathematicians against Fibonacci, the Italian, and of course Fibonacci comes up with the Fibonacci sequence of widths. But this is the final denouement of this book. But I'm having great fun putting it all together at the moment.
Wow, there were so many plot twists I was not expecting, from these Buddhist monks converting to Islam to a math contest in Italy. I can't wait to read this. It seems like it's going to pull together a lot of different threads from your work, from the so-called Near East Christian, or Syria Christian world, to the Far East. And
all sorts of stuff I've never written about at all, like Bali.
I, for one, can't wait to read it. I'll definitely talk. Yeah. Well, I'll definitely get in touch with you after this. I'm sure you're going to love the living Tantra traditions in Java, which I got to know a little bit of.
Because you're going to have to give me guidance after we end this. You must send me lots of
I will definitely vibe with you. But I'm very excited to read about Indonesia through your eyes. I think you're going to absolutely love it. We're coming up on the hour. Yeah.
Just to finish, I've had this weird thing because of lockdown. I mean, my plan in March was to head off to Java and to go and see Borobudur and Prambanan and all these places, and Angkor Wat again. But of course, lockdown came. So I've been sitting reading all this stuff, but not being able to actually go and see it. So I've got such a sort of thirst to discover all this stuff. I've never been to Borobudur, longing for it.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely incredible. I don't know how to see it from the air. I feel like that would be, in some ideal world, if you could like get a helicopter to see the mandala structure of it, that would probably be ideal. I don't know if you can call in your favors, but you have plenty of time to figure that out. I think you're gonna have a fantastic trip.
Got a helicopter? Just let me know, please.
You never know. It's Indonesia's just like India. Sometimes the calling in a favor will go farther than you could ever imagine.
Well, get in touch with Janet or all the Bali Lit Fest people. They'll get through to me.
Yes. Well, we can't wait to see what you find there. William, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I encourage everyone to read The Anarchy and any of his other books. You could close your eyes and pick one off the shelf. They're guaranteed to be a good time. This was a huge privilege talking to one of the writers I most look up to. So thanks for making time for us, William. I had to say this just to sign off. Kembali 20 was made possible with the support of the Yayasan Mudraswari Saraswati. William, there's some more Hindu influence for you. Patron program and their donors. The patron program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals and the foundation. By making a valuable contribution to the Yayasan patron program, you'll be directly involved in delivering both festivals in due time. Your contribution will guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative arts. Follow Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information. Thank you, everyone. Terima kasih.